Thank you for joining me here today. My name is Jim Beasley. I'm an associate professor in the University of Georgia, the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources, and the Savannah River Ecology Lab. And today I'm going to be talking about wild boar actually in their part of their native range. And I'm going to be talking about a unique landscape and a unique situation where we're looking at the rewilding of the Fukushima human evacuation zone, specifically talking about wild boar, but I'll also touch on a few other species as well. And I'd like to give a shout out to the co-authors, Phillip, Lyons, Okuda, Matt Hamilton, and Tom Hinton, who are all integral components of this study. So when most of us think of nuclear accidents and nuclear disasters, some sort of image somewhat like this comes to mind. These abandoned structures that are rotting, decaying infrastructure, and these landscapes that are largely devoid of life. And usually Chernobyl is the situation that comes to most people's mind. And any animals there must look something like this: highly mutated, deformed, low survival, if any survival whatsoever. And a lot of that's driven by popular media. There's video games about Chernobyl and movies about Chernobyl that all depict this landscape as this radioactive wasteland where animals couldn't possibly survive. And so from a scientific perspective, I just want to talk a little bit about what we do know about Chernobyl before we get into the Fukushima accident. And we do know that in the immediate aftermath after Chernobyl, it was a devastating human crisis situation, an environmental disaster, and there were severe initial effects to biota. On that figure that you can see there, that's what's known as the red forest, where the entire pine forest in that area died from radiation exposure that you can see in the foreground there. In the background, you can see the actual reactor. That's a fairly small part of Chernobyl, but basically a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor in Chernobyl was evacuated and for human health and safety concerns. And so we do know that both plants and animals were highly susceptible to radiation exposure and succumbed to radiation exposure at that time. And so there's been a lot of interest in what are the prolonged long-term effects at the individual level, at the population level, and at the community level. And we know that dose rates in Chernobyl are about 100 times lower than they were right after the accident, which doesn't suggest that it's not contaminated. Still one of the most contaminated places on Earth, but the dose rates are considerably lower than right after the accident, and at levels where we wouldn't necessarily expect major population level effects throughout most of the exclusion zone. Despite that, there's been a handful of studies that have suggested that there could be population effects and individual level effects. However, some of the methods and other aspects of those studies have been challenged. So there's been a call for more research to better understand what the individual through community level effects of nuclear accidents and nuclear radiation exposure actually are. And so there's been some recent research that is focused on large mammals, as you can see from this figure here, that has shown that after the accident in the first decade, populations of many large mammals increased fairly rapidly. And the blue bars in this figure here are wild boar. Wild boar have fairly high reproductive capacity. And you can see in that first several years, populations of boar really exploded until 1994 when we had a crash. That was due to a disease, swine fever, that went through the population at that time. In fact, right now, obviously, most of you are aware they're going through that again in much of that part of the world. And so not only did this work show that these animals increased in abundance, but it also showed that they're widely distributed, including some of the most contaminated areas have large, robust populations of wolves and other large mammals. But one of the challenges with Chernobyl is right outside the landscape is highly agriculture, and so it's difficult to have adequate control areas. The study I'm talking about had some control areas in other nature reserves in Belarus. However, there's been a call for a lot more research to use other control areas to try and better tease out the effects of radiation and human habitation on that landscape. As I mentioned, people were evacuated, which has really brought up the question of whether these abandoned nuclear accident sites are serving as ecological sinks, as been proposed in some of the literature, or nature reserves, which has also been proposed. And so this is a really contrasting set of paradigms here. And it's even more more conflicted because in Chernobyl, anyways, they've introduced populations of European bison and highly endangered Przewalski's horses. And so we've got these animals that have been introduced into these nuclear landscapes, as well as animals like brown bear, Eurasian lynx, and a number of other species that have naturally colonized and are now surviving. So the question is, what are the effects to these species, if any, and should we be managing them in any different way? So fast forward to 2011, and unfortunately, we had another very severe level 7 nuclear accident. In Japan, there was a major earthquake off the east coast of north central Japan, which created a tremendous tsunami. As you can see here, most of you probably remember this accident. It was a major loss of human life, major damage throughout the east coast of north central Japan. Just a really devastating human and environmental tragedy. And on top of all that, there was a meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant that disseminated radiation throughout the environment and created another situation where humans had to be evacuated from the landscape, much like Chernobyl. And so this is what that radiation distribution looks like. You can see the reactor there, and the majority of the radiation in Fukushima Daiichi's case went into the ocean, but a huge swath went kind of northwest from the reactor out into the environment. And red, yellow, and green areas that you can see there, those are where humans were evacuated. And so this green and red area that I've highlighted here, this is what was created as the Fukushima Daiichi human evacuation zone. However, radiation levels have fallen since that time, and so there's been some changes to the landscape that sets up a unique experimental opportunity. So today, there's still a large area, 371 square kilometers, that's evacuated. This is what I'm going to refer to as the Fukushima Exclusion Zone. Then we have this green area, which I'm going to refer to as the restricted zone. This is an area that was previously evacuated, but after about 5 or 6 years, they began allowing people to return to their former residences. And so some of this was due to just natural radioactive decay, but in all these areas, there was also extensive remediation, like you can see on the figure in the bottom left there, where they scraped the topsoil, removed vegetation, and cleared a lot of the contamination out of the way to make room for people to repopulate. Although I'll point out that only about 5 to 10% of the human population's returned since then. And then on top of that, we've got a control area that received very low or no levels of radiation, and people were never evacuated. And so, unlike Chernobyl, we've got this unique situation where we have these two different evacuation zones that have differing levels of human activity, and right next door to both of them, in a very close proximity within the same habitat conditions, we've got a control area where humans were never evacuated, which sets up the nature of this experiment, or with what I'm going to talk about today. Our goal was to quantify the distribution and abundance of wildlife, particularly wild boar, within Fukushima Prefecture right after the accident, or within the first 5 years or so, to see how wildlife had responded. And we specifically focused on these 3 different zones of human habitation, but also factored into things like radiation levels at the sites we monitored, habitat covariates, and things of that nature, and looked at both the abundance of these species and occupancy patterns. And on top of that, particularly with wild boar, we were interested in looking at their behavioral patterns and whether or not we could see any shifts in their diurnal patterns of activity compared to the areas where there were people and evacuated areas, to see if wild boar were shifting their behavior in abandoned areas. And so this was an entirely camera-based experiment that I'm going to talk about today. And all these dots on the left side are remote camera locations, as you can see. And so we ended up with 120 locations. So this was a massive effort conducted over a several month period. And so in each one of these zones, we had 40 locations, and we split those locations by elevation category. So we've got a coastal area where the reactor is, as you can see in red there. But then this quickly moves up into the mountains. So this is a highly mountainous area. And so as you might expect, there might be different species in these different areas, or at least different abundance of species. So we wanted to factor that into our models as well. And so these were unbaited camera sites that were set on game trails. and we deployed cameras in 2-month intervals. And so we had cameras out for 2 months, and then went in a few months later and repeated that. So each site had 4 months worth of data that feeds into the analysis that I'm going to talk about. So from that work, we ended up with several 100,000 images, really some amazing diversity of wildlife there. Up on the upper left, you'll see Japanese macaques, species of primate that's native to Japan. Upper middle, that's a raccoon dog, another native species to the region. Upper right is a masked palm civet. It's actually an invasive species. On the bottom left, that's a Japanese siro. It's most similar to a mountain goat, except it inhabits more forested regions. Red fox, and then of course wild boar, which I'll be mostly focusing on here. And this is just a quick video that shows some of these species, just animated, just so we can have a look at what some of the species we found were. So really an incredible diversity of wildlife. As I mentioned, several 100,000 pictures that I'm going to distill down to just a few figures here. So there's a lot more that we're in the processes of extracting at the moment. But from those images, we distill them down to numbers of unique detections. And so that was each time a new triggering event occurred. We separated those events based on time. And we ended up detecting 20 wildlife species. This doesn't include domestic dogs or cats. 20 different wildlife species, mostly mammals, mid to large size mammals. But what I think is quite interesting in this figure here is that we detected more wild boar. We had more wild boar detections than all other species combined. So this suggests that wild boar are quite abundant in this landscape. In fact, as you walk around and drive around, you see wild boar routinely throughout the landscape. And so the next most abundant species, at least in terms of detections, were raccoon dogs and Japanese hare. But in general, just an exceptional number of wild boar detections throughout the landscape. So we then used these data and fed them into some occupancy and abundance models in unmarked. And we use these 3 different human habitation zones as factors in our models. We use radiation levels because there's some ideas in the literature that haven't really been verified, but they're at least out there suggesting animals avoid these areas of more contamination. So we included that as covariate in our models, as well as some different habitat and elevation covariates, and use model selection criteria to look at what variables were driving where we see these species on the landscape. So I'm only going to present the abundance data, not the occupancy data, but the occupancy data pretty much mirrors this almost identically. And so this is a pretty busy figure, so I'll give you a minute to digest this, and I'll walk you through it. But these are several of the most common species, and we've got them broken down by the exclusion zone, the restricted zone, and the inhabited zone in those 3 different bar charts there for each species. And what we found through our models is that zone, human habitation zone, or zone by elevation interaction were the primary variables driving 6 of the species that we found on the landscape, with 5 of those species, the strongest model being those suggesting that populations were most abundant in areas that had been evacuated, with the only exception being the Japanese siro. That's that mountain goat like animal that I mentioned. And across all these species, we saw no negative influence of radiation levels on where we find them on the landscape. In fact, habitat attributes were the most common predictor of where they occurred if zone wasn't the strongest model in our model selection results. But of the 3 species that exhibited the most strong positive response, wild boar, raccoon, and macaque, these are all species that are commonly in conflict with humans. I know we don't often, at least in the US, think of primates as conflict species, but they raid crops routinely. They're a highly adaptable generalist. And so both wild boar, raccoon, and macaques are controlled in parts of Japan because of these human-wildlife conflict issues. And those are the species where we're seeing the most dramatic positive response in the absence of humans. Now, looking specifically at wild boar, this figure on the left shows the relative abundance based on each of our camera locations, and the figure on the right shows the relative abundance of wild boar across 3 different zones. So this is that same figure from that previous slide. And as you can see, we have a very large difference in wild boar abundance between these zones, with almost 4 times more boar in the exclusion zone compared to the inhabited zone. And I'll point out that this is despite the fact that within the excluded and restricted zones, there's an extensive government culling campaign to reduce wild boar numbers. Wild boar, they've recognized that the population's increasing and causing tremendous amounts of damage. And so they've gone in and hired contractors that actively remove hundreds or thousands of boar each year in those areas. And so despite those efforts, we're still seeing massive populations compared to the inhabited area. Now, as I mentioned, the only species where we see the opposite trend is the Japanese siro in terms of their abundance, where they are most abundant in the inhabited area, as you can see here. And so this really left us scratching our head as to whether or not this could be a radiation-induced effect or something like that. But radiation had no influence on siro. In fact, elevation was the primary attribute driving where we find them in the landscape. This is a species that is, as you'd expect, in the mountains, so we don't find them really in coastal areas. However, in the literature, siro tend to be highly sensitive to other ungulates. They can be displaced by other ungulates, and there's not a lot of good information that I'm aware of in terms of that interaction with wild boar. I don't know that it's been explored all that much. And so one of our hypotheses is that maybe wild boar could be displacing the species. And so when we run a model looking at the correlation between siro abundance and wild boar abundance at individual sites, you see a very significant and very strong negative correlation. So those areas that have more wild boar have the fewest numbers of Japanese siro. So correlation is not causation, but it's something that certainly warrants some further explanation, and I think is a reasonable hypothesis that we can explore a little bit further moving forward. Now, as I've kind of alluded to, this massive increase in wild boar numbers has created a real substantial issue on the landscape. On the right there, that's a former agricultural area, and so a rice paddy area. Wild boar have come in and are really causing a tremendous amount of rooting damage throughout the landscape. And you can see a house there in the background. On the left there, that's actually a school, an abandoned school. That's a playground right there that boar was captured in. And that's a routine setting in terms of where these trappers set traps. They often set them in urban and suburban areas, and that's where they're catching large numbers of these animals. And so without people, wild boar and other wildlife have moved in and are starting to cause some damage, which from a pure evacuated area standpoint may not be the biggest deal in some respects. However, there's these areas where they're trying to remediate the landscape and encourage people to repopulate. But when you have wild boar coming and damaging your property because they're so abundant, that's causing some issues and probably some challenges for folks that are trying to move back to their former residences. And it's not just limited to wild boar. Japanese macaques are a highly adaptable general species. This is a troop that we photographed on an abandoned house. You could routinely see them running in and out of this house, and this is a somewhat common sighting in some areas, and not just the macaques, the civets, the raccoons. All these species, they're adaptable, and this is something similar that we see in Chernobyl as well, where these animals are taking advantage of these structures that humans have left behind and are using them, and of course causing some damage issues, especially when we're talking about places where people are hopefully someday going to return to. And so given that, we've kind of expanded some of this work in the past couple of years, especially through our collaborators at Fukushima University, and we started to study the movement ecology of these various species. And I don't have a lot of results to present here, so I'm just going to talk about some preliminary results that kind of tie into the theme of what I've been talking about. And so we've been attaching GPS transmitters to some reptiles, some mesocarnivores, and most notably wild boar, and have attached transmitters to a number of wild boar at this point, where we're actually recording radiation levels that they're experiencing. We're looking at health effects, and then we're also looking at the movements to understand how these animals are adapting to these abandoned landscapes. And across the board, regardless of what species that we've been tracking, we're seeing a pretty remarkable adaptability to these abandoned landscapes. So we have snakes, civets, and even wild boar extensively using abandoned buildings and structures. That figure on the left showing all those GPS locations, that's a wild boar. It's a pretty common, I just picked one, but that's a pretty common occurrence. And basically that individual is moving from one backyard to another, probably taking advantage of the cover that's now there from the overgrown vegetation, probably some abandoned gardens and fruit trees and things of that nature that they're able to take advantage of. And so one of the things that really seems to be going on here is that these former suburban and urban areas have now really expanded the amount of habitat that's available to these animals on the landscape. And I suspect that this is part of the reason of what's supporting their increased population growth in these areas, particularly these abandoned areas where people haven't returned to. The animals just are allowed to have the capability of moving into areas that they formerly couldn't just because people were there. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we've also been interested in understanding how wild boar may have shifted their activity patterns. Again, this is a highly adaptable species, one of the most adaptable species, I think many would argue. And when you drive around the evacuation zone in Fukushima, this picture on the left is something that is not all that uncommon. You see them walking around in the middle of the day along roads in former towns. And so we actually looked at some of our activity data and ran some activity models. And as you can see, these are the three different zones. Again, the red, green, and blue lines there, the red being the excluded zone. We see primarily crepuscular activity with animals also extending that activity through the night. But based on these models, we see a significant difference in these activity curves throughout the day. And I'll kind of direct your attention to the center of that graph there. And what's notable to me is that we see considerably more activity during the middle of the day. And so these wild boar in the abandoned areas have almost twice as much activity as in the inhabited and restricted zone during the day. And I think that's kind of reflecting those personal observations that I talked about, where you routinely see these animals walking around during the day in certain areas, particularly areas that really don't have a lot of people. So this is something that we're currently in the process of following up on with some more hard telemetry data to really explore these activity patterns a little bit more. So just to wrap up and leave you with a few concluding thoughts here. So just very similar to Chernobyl, in these initial years after the Fukushima Daiichi accident, we're seeing some pretty substantial increases in abundance of some animals that are often in conflict with humans, particularly wild boar, but also macaques and raccoons, where they seem to be benefiting from the fact that humans aren't there, and particularly through exploiting urbanized areas that formerly they had a difficult time inhabiting just because people were there. And ultimately, this is a challenge when we think about people trying to return to evacuated zones in terms of human wildlife conflicts. And it's going to be something that is going to be ongoing management throughout the years to come. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is, radiation is a good thing for animals and that nuclear accidents are a good thing in any way. These are tremendous human tragedies and environmental tragedies. And we do know that radiation causes some severe effects at high doses. But I think what this does suggest is that if there are any effects, they're not manifesting at the population level. They're occurring at probably the molecular level, or maybe the individual level, if that's the case, and probably only in areas that have the highest doses that animals are experiencing. And so ultimately, I think this suggests that these abandoned areas are serving as a net benefit to wildlife, although there's still a lot of need for more research to better understand what those molecular and individual level effects are. And so with that, I want to thank the Institute of the IER at Fukushima University. I'd also like to thank the US DOE and the University of Georgia for supporting this work. And if you have any questions about this work or any related work, I'd be happy to answer your questions through email, and you can find my email address below. Thanks.